The dust cloud on the horizon caught Nathan Turner's attention, just as the sun began its descent behind the New Mexico mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that reminded him why he'd chosen this God-forsaken territory over the crowded streets of St. Louis. It was late September 1878, and he'd been tracking a stray mustang for 3 days through the rough country north of Los Alamos, when he stumbled upon the cabin tucked into a canyon wall, so hidden by scrub oak and juniper that most men would have ridden right past it without a second glance. Nathan dismounted from his gelding, a sturdy bay he'd named Copper for the reddish gleam in his coat, and approached the weathered structure with caution born from years of surviving in territory where danger wore many faces. The cabin looked abandoned at first, its wooden planks bleached gray by sun and wind, the windows dark and empty. But something made him pause. Smoke, thin as a whisper, curled from the stone chimney. He loosened his revolver in its holster and called out, "Hello, the house. I'm just a traveler looking for water. I mean no harm." For a long moment, nothing. Then the door creaked open just enough for him to see a slice of darkness beyond and the glint of what might have been eyes catching the dying light. "Go away." The voice was feminine, hoarse as if from disuse, but carrying an edge of desperation that made Nathan's chest tighten with unexpected concern. "Madam, I truly mean no harm. I've been tracking mustangs for days and my canteen's nearly dry. If you could spare some water, I'll be on my way." Another pause, longer this time. Nathan remained still, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapon. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. His face bore the weathered tan of a man who lived under the sky, and though he'd only seen 26 years, the lines around his eyes spoke of hardship and determination. The door opened wider. A woman stood in the threshold, thin as a willow branch, with hair the color of autumn wheat falling in tangled waves past her shoulders. She wore a dress that had once been blue but was now faded to the color of winter sky, and she held a rifle that trembled slightly in her grip. "There's a well around back," she said. "Take what you need and go." Nathan nodded slowly, studying her face in the fading light. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with features that would have been striking if not for the hollow shadows beneath her cheekbones and the haunted quality in her green eyes. "Thank you kindly, madam. I appreciate it." He led Copper around the cabin, finding the well right where she'd indicated. As he drew water for his horse and refilled his canteen, his mind worked through what he'd seen. The woman was clearly alone, clearly struggling. The cabin might have looked abandoned from the outside, but someone had been maintaining it well enough to keep the chimney drawing and the door on its hinges. Nathan had never been a man to leave a problem unsolved, especially when that problem involved someone in need. His mother had raised him better than that. God rest her soul. He finished watering Copper and then, instead of mounting up and riding away like the woman had clearly wanted, he walked back to the front of the cabin. She was still standing in the doorway, the rifle now lowered but not set aside. Up close, Nathan could see she'd been pretty once, before whatever had brought her to this isolated place had worn her down to bone and will. "Madam, I don't mean to overstep, but are you all right out here? This cabin's a fair distance from anywhere." "I'm fine." The words came too quickly, too defensive. "When's the last time you had a proper meal, or saw another person?" Her jaw tightened. "That's none of your concern, mister." "Maybe not, but my conscience won't let me ride away knowing someone's in trouble. I'm Nathan Turner. I work a ranch about 2 days' ride south of here. If you need help getting to town, or I can't leave." The words burst from her lips with such force that she seemed to surprise herself. She swallowed hard, her knuckles white where she gripped the door frame. "I have to stay here. I'm waiting." Nathan felt something shift in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. "Waiting for what, madam?" She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something crumble behind her eyes, some wall she'd been maintaining through sheer force of will. "For someone to find me." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from the chimney. Nathan took a careful step closer. "Well, madam, I reckon I just did." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and the rifle slipped from her fingers to clatter on the wooden porch. Nathan moved instinctively to catch her as her knees buckled, and she was so light in his arms that it scared him more than any outlaw's gun ever had. He carried her inside the cabin, kicking the door shut behind him. The interior was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed in one corner, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, and precious little else. He laid her on the bed as gently as he could and quickly surveyed what supplies she had. A nearly empty sack of flour, some dried beans, a few strips of jerky so old they looked like leather. Nathan cursed under his breath and went back outside to his saddlebags, retrieving the provisions he'd brought for his tracking expedition. When he returned, the woman had regained consciousness and was trying to sit up, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what came over me." "Don't apologize, madam. When did you last eat?" She looked away. "Yesterday, I think. The days tend to run together." Nathan built up the fire and set about making a simple stew with the dried beef and vegetables he'd been carrying. As the food cooked, he learned her name was Margot Wright, and the story she told him made his blood run alternately hot with anger and cold with horror. She'd come to New Mexico territory 6 months ago with her older brother, a man named Samuel, who'd gotten it into his head that there was silver to be found in these mountains. They'd bought supplies in Los Alamos and set out to stake a claim, full of hope and dreams. They'd found this cabin, abandoned by some prospector who'd given up or died, and made it their base. "Samuel was good to me," Margot said, her voice barely above a whisper as Nathan handed her a bowl of stew. "After our parents died of fever 2 years ago in Kansas, he was all I had left. He promised he'd take care of me, that we'd make a new life out here." Nathan sat on the floor near the hearth, giving her space, eating his own portion slowly. "What happened to him?" Margot's hands shook as she lifted the spoon to her lips. She took a bite, closed her eyes as if the simple act of eating was overwhelming, then set the bowl aside. Nathan wanted to encourage her to eat more but sensed she needed to talk first. 3 months ago, he went out to check his claim lines up in the higher elevations. Said he'd be back before dark. Her voice had gone flat, emotionless, and Nathan recognized it as the tone of someone who'd told themselves a story so many times it had become rote. "He never came back. I waited 3 days, then went looking for him. I'm not good at tracking, not like Samuel was, but I found his hat caught on a bush near the edge of a ravine. I looked down and I saw his body at the bottom. The rocks there, they're all loose shale. He must have slipped." "I'm sorry," Nathan said, and meant it. "I couldn't get down there. I tried, but the way was too steep, too dangerous. I came back here and She paused, her throat working. "I didn't know what to do. Samuel had the map to get back to Los Alamos. He was the one who knew the trails. I tried to leave twice, but I got turned around both times and barely made it back to the cabin. The second time, I realized I was just wasting energy and supplies I couldn't afford to waste." Nathan felt his jaw tighten with frustration at the situation, at the tragedy of it. "So you decided to wait. Samuel told me before we left Los Alamos that if we didn't come back within 6 months, The man who sold us the supplies would send someone to check on us. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd stay put and wait for help. Margot looked at Nathan with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. Today marks 6 months exactly. The coincidence of his arrival struck Nathan silent for a moment. Some might call it providence. Others might call it dumb luck. Whatever it was, he was grateful for it. "You kept your promise to your brother," Nathan said quietly. "That took courage." "It took stubbornness," Margot corrected, and there was a flash of spirit in her voice that gave him hope. "And desperation, and probably a fair amount of foolishness. Survival isn't foolish. You stayed alive alone for 3 months with almost no supplies. That's resourceful." Margot picked up the bowl again and took another careful bite. "I trapped rabbits when I could. There's a spring not far from here. I rationed what Samuel had bought. But the traps haven't caught anything in over a week, and the flour ran out days ago." Nathan let her eat in silence for a while, his mind already working through logistics. The sun had fully set now, and darkness pressed against the cabin windows. It was too late to start back toward civilization, and besides, Margot was in no condition to travel. She needed rest and proper food to build up her strength. "Madam, with your permission, I'd like to stay here tonight and help you get to Los Alamos tomorrow. My horse is strong enough to carry us both if we take it slow." Margot looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since he'd arrived. Nathan met her gaze steadily, letting her see that his intentions were honorable. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her because she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "No repayment needed. Any decent person would do the same." She smiled at that, a small, fragile thing that nonetheless transformed her face. "I think you'd be surprised how few decent people there are in the world." "Maybe. But I aim to prove that there are at least some of us left." Nathan insisted that Margot keep the bed while he made himself comfortable on the floor near the fire. He'd slept in worse places during his years working cattle drives and ranch work. Before they settled in for the night, he convinced her to eat another half bowl of stew, pleased to see some color returning to her cheeks. As the fire crackled and popped, Nathan found himself studying her profile in the flickering light. There was a strength to Margot Wright that circumstances hadn't been able to break, a core of determination that had kept her alive through an ordeal that would have destroyed lesser people. He admired that. He admired her. "Mr. Turner." Her voice came soft through the darkness. "Yes, madam." "Why were you out here tracking mustangs?" Nathan shifted, pulling his bedroll more securely around his shoulders. "The ranch I work for, the Double T, we've been trying to build up our herd. Wild mustangs are tough, smart horses once you break them properly. They're worth the effort. I saw signs of a good stallion a few days back and got it in my head to follow the trail." "Did you find him?" "No, madam, but I found something more important." He heard her breath catch, heard the rustle of blankets as she turned toward him. "You barely know me." "True enough. But I know enough to recognize someone worth helping when I see them." Silence fell again, but it was comfortable now, companionable. Nathan listened to the sounds of the night outside, the distant call of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the canyon, and allowed himself to relax. Tomorrow they'd make the journey to Los Alamos. He'd see her safely settled, make sure she had what she needed, and then what? The thought troubled him more than it should have. He'd go back to the Double T, back to his work, back to his routine. But somehow the idea of simply leaving Margot Wright in Los Alamos and riding away sat poorly in his chest. He was still pondering this when sleep claimed him. Morning came with pale light filtering through the cabin's single window. Nathan woke to find Margot already up, standing at the hearth stirring something in a battered pot. She'd done what she could to tidy her appearance, braiding her long hair and smoothing her dress, though there was nothing to be done about the worn patches and stains. "I made coffee," she said, and there was pride in her voice. "Or what passes for it? Samuel bought a bag in Los Alamos, and I've been making it stretch. This might be the last of it, but I figured this morning was worth celebrating." Nathan accepted the tin cup she offered and took a sip. It was weak and bitter, but it was warm and contained some measure of caffeine, which was enough. "It's perfect. Thank you." They shared a simple breakfast of the remaining stew and some hardtack from Nathan's supplies, then set about preparing for the journey. Margot had little to pack, her worldly possessions fitting into a single worn carpetbag. She moved through the cabin with a strange mixture of haste and reluctance, touching things as if memorizing them through her fingertips. "This was supposed to be our new start," she said, running her hand along the rough table. "Samuel was so sure we'd strike it rich. He'd tell me stories every night about the house we'd build, the land we'd buy. He wanted to give me a good life, the kind our parents would have wanted for us." Nathan understood the need to speak of the dead, to keep their memory alive through words. He stood quietly, letting her talk. "He was 28, you know. Not old, but old enough to feel responsible for me after Mama and Papa died. He put aside his own plans, his own dreams, to make sure I'd be taken care of." Margot's voice cracked. "And I got him killed." "That's not true," Nathan said firmly. "What happened to your brother was an accident, a terrible tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. If he hadn't been worried about me, about making a fortune to provide for me, he never would have come out here." Nathan set down his own bag and crossed to where she stood, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his presence. "From what you've told me, your brother loved you and would have done anything to see you safe and happy. That's not a burden you forced on him. That was his choice, made out of love. And if you spend the rest of your life blaming yourself for his death, then you're dishonoring the sacrifice he made." Margot looked up at him with swimming eyes. "How do I let go of the guilt? I don't think you do, not completely. But you can choose to live the kind of life that would make him proud. You can survive, and more than survive. You can thrive. That's what he'd want for you." She nodded slowly, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "You're right. I know you're right. It's just hard. The hardest things usually are." They finished gathering her belongings, and Nathan helped her lock up the cabin. Margot hesitated at the door one last time, her hand on the frame, then turned and walked away without looking back. Nathan admired the strength that took. Getting both of them on copper required some creative positioning. Nathan sat in the saddle with Margot perched in front of him, her carpetbag secured behind. It was intimate, closer than was probably proper for two people who'd known each other less than a day, but there was no help for it. Nathan kept his arms loosely around her as he held the reins, trying to give her as much space as the arrangement allowed. "You just tell me if you need to rest," he said. "There's no rush." "I'm fine," Margot replied, but he could feel the tension in her body, the way she held herself rigid to avoid touching him more than necessary. They set off as the sun climbed higher, following game trails and dry washes that Nathan navigated with the ease of long experience. He talked as they rode, pointing out landmarks, telling her stories about the territory and his work at the Double T. He could feel her gradually relaxing against him, exhaustion overcoming propriety as the gentle rocking of the horse's gait lulled her. By midday, she was leaning fully back against his chest, her head tucked beneath his chin, breathing deep and even in sleep. Nathan adjusted his hold on her carefully, making sure she wouldn't slip, and found himself struck by the trust implicit in her rest. She barely knew him, had no reason to believe he was who he said he was, yet here she was, vulnerable and unguarded in his arms. He would prove worthy of that trust. He swore it to himself as they traveled under the bright New Mexico sky. Margot woke as they stopped to water Copper at a small creek. She jerked upright, disoriented, then flushed crimson when she realized she'd been sleeping against Nathan. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. No apology needed," Nathan said easily, dismounting and then helping her down. "You were exhausted. Your body took what it needed." She stretched, wincing at stiffness, and Nathan pretended not to notice as he tended to the horse. They shared some dried beef and the last of his biscuits, sitting on sun-warmed rocks by the creek. "Can I ask you something?" Margot said after a while, "Of course." "Why aren't you married? A man like you with steady work and a good heart seems like you'd have women lining up." Nathan chuckled, surprised by the question. "A man like me spends most of his time covered in dust and horse smell, sleeping on the ground and eating beans from a can. Not exactly what most women are looking for in a husband." "I think you'd be surprised what women are looking for," Margot said softly. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something electric and unexpected. Nathan felt his heart kick up its rhythm, felt heat that had nothing to do with the sun climbing up his neck. "What about you?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. "Was there someone back in Kansas?" Margot shook her head. "There was a boy who was sweet on me, a farmer's son named Peter, but I didn't feel anything for him beyond friendship. Samuel used to tease me, said I was too particular, but I always thought—" She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "I always thought that, when I met the right person, I'd know. That it would feel like something clicking into place, like finding something I didn't know I'd been missing." Nathan wanted to ask if she felt that click, if the connection he sensed between them was mutual or just wishful thinking on his part. But it was too soon, too presumptuous. Instead, he stood and offered her his hand. "We should keep moving. With luck, we'll make Los Alamos by nightfall." She took his hand, her fingers small and calloused in his grip, and let him help her to her feet. But she didn't let go right away, and neither did he. They stood there by the creek, hands clasped, and Nathan felt the world narrow to just the two of them, to the bird song in the cottonwoods and the whisper of water over stone and the green of her eyes. "Nathan," she said, his name soft on her lips, and he realized it was the first time she'd used his given name. "Yes, thank you, for everything, for finding me, for not giving up on me, for being exactly who I needed you to be." "Margot," he said, and her name felt right in his mouth, felt like something precious. "I think I'm the one who should be thanking you." "For what?" He wanted to say for reminding me what it feels like to care about someone, for making me believe in fate, for looking at me like I'm someone worth knowing. Instead, he smiled and said, "For the weak coffee." She laughed, the sound bright as bells, and the moment broke. But as they remounted and continued their journey, Nathan could feel that something fundamental had shifted between them. The thread of connection had been acknowledged, if not yet named. They reached Los Alamos as the sun painted the adobe buildings in shades of orange and gold. The town was small but bustling, with a main street lined with shops and businesses serving the ranchers and miners who worked the surrounding territory. Nathan guided Copper to the town's only hotel, a two-story structure with a hand-painted sign reading, "Diamond Rest." He helped Margot dismount, acutely aware of the curious stares they were attracting. A dusty cowboy with a half-starved woman was bound to cause talk in a town this size. Nathan ignored the looks and escorted Margot inside, where a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair looked up from behind the registration desk. "Good evening," Nathan said, removing his hat. "The lady needs a room, and I'd appreciate it if you could have a bath and some hot food sent up." The woman's shrewd eyes took in Margot's condition, and Nathan saw her expression soften. "Of course." That'll be 50 cents for the room, another quarter for the bath, and dinner from the restaurant next door will run you about the same." Nathan fished coins from his pocket and laid them on the desk. "Add another night's stay and another day's meals to that if you would." "Nathan, you don't have to," Margot started, but he shook his head. "Let me do this, please." The hotel woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, led Margot upstairs while Nathan saw to Copper's stabling at the livery. When he returned, Mrs. Patterson informed him that Margot was soaking in the bath and that he was to come back in an hour when she'd be presentable and fed. Nathan used the time to visit the general store where he purchased a new dress, undergarments, stockings, and shoes for Margot, guessing at her sizes. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles, raised his eyebrows but took Nathan's money without comment. An hour later, Nathan knocked on Margot's door, the parcels clutched in his hands. She opened it wearing a robe Mrs. Patterson must have loaned her, her hair still damp and hanging loose around her shoulders. Her face was clean of dirt for the first time since he'd met her, and Nathan felt his breath catch at her beauty. "I brought you some things," he said, offering her the packages. "I hope they fit. If they don't, we can exchange them tomorrow." Margot took the parcels with trembling hands, her eyes wide. "Nathan, this is too much. I can't accept all this." "You can and you will. Consider it a loan if that makes you feel better. You can pay me back once you get settled, find work." She set the packages on the bed and turned back to him, and before he could react, she'd thrown her arms around his neck and was hugging him with fierce intensity. Nathan froze for a heartbeat, then carefully wrapped his arms around her waist, holding her close. "No one's ever been this kind to me," she whispered against his shoulder. "Not since my parents died." "You deserve kindness," Nathan said, and he meant it with everything in him. They stood like that for a long moment before Margot pulled back, wiping at her eyes. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I'm not sorry," Nathan interrupted, and the honesty in his voice made her look up at him. "I'm not sorry at all." Something passed between them again, that same electric current he'd felt by the creek. Nathan wanted to kiss her, wanted it with an intensity that surprised him, but it was too soon, too fast, no matter what his heart was telling him. "I should let you rest," he said, forcing himself to step back. "I'll be staying at the boarding house down the street. Tomorrow we can figure out your situation, see about finding you work and lodging here in town." "Will you stay?" The question came out rushed, desperate. "In Los Alamos, I mean. Not forever, but just for a little while, until I get my feet under me." Nathan had responsibilities at the Double T. He'd been gone for nearly a week already, and his boss would be expecting him back. But looking at Margot's face, at the hope and fear warring in her expression, he found he couldn't refuse her. "I'll stay as long as you need me." The smile she gave him was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." "You'd have survived," Nathan said with certainty. "You're stronger than you know, Margot Wright." After leaving her to rest, Nathan found the boarding house and paid for a room, then headed to the saloon for a drink and information. The barkeep, a jovial man named Frank, was happy to talk once Nathan bought a whiskey. "You're asking about work for a young woman," Frank said, wiping down the bar. "Well now, that depends on what kind of work she's looking for. If she can cook or clean, Mrs. Chen, who runs the restaurant, is always complaining about needing help. If she's educated, the schoolmarm position's been empty since Miss Adams married that rancher from Santa Fe last spring." "She's educated," Nathan confirmed, remembering the proper way Margot spoke, the intelligence in her eyes. "Anything else?" "There's the dress shop. Old Mrs. Martinez is getting on in years and could use an apprentice who's good with needle and thread." Or if your lady friend is willing to work hard and doesn't mind getting her hands dirty, there's always washing and mending to be done. Nathan spent the next hour learning everything he could about opportunities in Los Alamos, filing the information away for discussion with Margot in the morning. When he finally made his way back to the boarding house, the sky was full dark, and the street lamps were being lit by the lamplighter making his rounds. Sleep came fitfully, his mind full of green eyes and wheat-colored hair and a smile that made him want to be a better man than he'd ever thought to be. Morning brought clarity and purpose. Nathan washed and shaved, put on his cleanest shirt, and made his way to the Diamond Rest just as the sun was climbing over the eastern mountains. Mrs. Patterson informed him that Margot had come down for breakfast and was currently eating in the small dining room. He found her at a corner table, wearing the new dress he'd bought her. It was a simple design in pale green calico, but it fit her well enough and brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was braided and pinned up, and she looked more like the young woman she should be and less like the half-starved survivor he'd found in the cabin. "Good morning," Nathan said, and she looked up with a smile that made his heart stutter. "Good morning. Please join me." "I ordered enough for two." Nathan sat across from her, accepting a plate of eggs and bacon and fried potatoes that tasted like heaven after days of trail food. They ate in comfortable silence for a while before turning to practical matters. "I spoke to some folks last night about possible work," Nathan began, outlining what he'd learned from Frank and others he'd encountered. Margot listened intently, asking thoughtful questions. "The schoolmarm position sounds interesting," she said. "I only finished the 8th grade myself, but I helped my mother teach Sunday school back in Kansas. I like children, and I can read and write and do mathematics well enough. We could speak to the mayor about it." "From what I understand, the last teacher left several months ago and families have been teaching their own children since then. The town would probably be grateful to have someone willing to take on the job. But would they hire someone like me? I have no experience, no references, and She paused, lowering her voice. "I'm in a delicate position. A young, unmarried woman traveling with a man who isn't her relative. People talk." Nathan felt anger kindle in his chest at the unfairness of it, at the way the world judged women more harshly than men. "Then we'll make sure people understand the truth of the situation. You were stranded and I helped you. There's nothing shameful in that." "You have more faith in human nature than I do," Margot said, but she was smiling. They spent the rest of the morning making the rounds in Los Alamos. The mayor, a portly man named Henderson, was indeed interested in hiring Margot as the schoolteacher once Nathan explained the circumstances of her arrival in town. However, he wanted to consult with the town council and the parents before making a final decision. "Come back in 3 days," Mayor Henderson said. "We'll have an answer for you then, Miss Wright. In the meantime, I'd suggest you familiarize yourself with the town and perhaps meet some of the families whose children you'd be teaching." They also visited Mrs. Chen at the restaurant, who offered Margot part-time work helping with food preparation and serving. "The pay isn't much," Mrs. Chen warned in her heavily accented English, "but you can eat while you work, and that's worth something." Margot accepted gratefully, and it was arranged that she'd start the following day. As they left the restaurant, she turned to Nathan with shining eyes. "I can't believe how much you've helped me in such a short time. A few days ago, I thought I might die alone in that cabin. Now I have prospects, possibilities. It's overwhelming." "You did this yourself," Nathan corrected. "I just opened a few doors. You're the one who has to walk through them." Over the next 3 days, Nathan found excuse after excuse to delay his return to the Double T. He told himself he needed to make sure Margot was settled, that it was his responsibility to see her situation through. But the truth, which he was becoming less and less able to deny, was that he simply didn't want to leave her. They fell into a routine of sorts. Margot would work the breakfast and lunch shifts at Mrs. Chen's restaurant, while Nathan did odd jobs around town, fixing fences and mucking stables, and anything else that would earn him enough to pay for his room and board. In the evenings, they'd walk together through Los Alamos, talking about everything and nothing. Nathan learned that Margot loved reading and had devoured every book she could get her hands on as a child. She confessed to a secret dream of one day writing stories of her own, though she'd never told anyone but her brother that ambition. "Samuel used to say I had too much imagination for my own good," she said as they strolled past the church one evening. "But he encouraged me to write anyway. Said the world needed more dreamers." "He sounds like he was a good man," Nathan said. "He was. I miss him every day." She paused, looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue of twilight. "But the grief isn't as sharp as it was. Being here, building something new, it helps." "Does that make me a terrible person?" "It makes you human. Your brother would want you to heal to move forward." Margot looked at him, and in her eyes, Nathan saw affection and trust and something deeper, something that made his pulse race. "You keep saying exactly what I need to hear." "How do you do that?" "Maybe I'm just saying what's true and you're finally ready to hear it." She stepped closer, close enough that Nathan could smell the soap she'd used that morning, could see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose. "Nathan, I need to tell you something. I'm listening. These past few days with you, they've been the happiest I can remember in a very long time. Not because of the help you've given me, though I'm grateful for that, but because of you, because of who you are and how you make me feel." She took a deep breath, gathering courage. "I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other, but I can't help what I feel." Your Nathan couldn't help himself. He closed the distance between them and kissed her, cutting off her words with the press of his lips against hers. For a heartbeat, Margot froze, and Nathan feared he'd misread the situation entirely. Then she melted against him, her arms coming up to circle his neck, and kissed him back with a passion that stole his breath. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "I was going to say the same thing. I think I've been falling for you since I found you in that cabin." "Love at first sight," Margot whispered. "I never believed in it before. Neither did I. But I believe in what I feel, and what I feel for you is as real as anything I've ever known." They kissed again, longer this time, deeper, and Nathan felt the world fall away until there was nothing but Margot in his arms and the certainty that he'd found something rare and precious. When they finally made their way back to the Diamond Rest, propriety dictated that they part at the entrance. But Nathan held Margot's hand a moment longer than necessary, reluctant to let her go. "The town council meets tomorrow to decide about the teaching position," she said. "I'm nervous." "Don't be. They'd be fools not to hire you. And if they don't, what then?" Nathan squeezed her hand. "Then we'll figure something else out, together." The word "together" seemed to resonate between them, full of promise and possibility. Margot smiled, squeezed back, and then slipped inside, leaving Nathan standing in the street with his heart full to bursting. The next day seemed to crawl by. Nathan tried to distract himself with work, helping the blacksmith shoe a particularly difficult mare, but his mind kept drifting to Margot and the town council meeting. Finally, as the sun began its descent, he made his way to the town hall where the meeting was being held. He arrived just as the doors opened and people began filing out. Nathan scanned the crowd anxiously until he spotted Margot emerging with Mayor Henderson. Her face was unreadable, and Nathan's stomach dropped. Then she saw him, and her expression transformed into pure joy. She ran to him, propriety forgotten, and threw herself into his arms. "I got it. They hired me. I'm the new school teacher." Nathan swung her around, laughing, drawing scandalized looks from some of the more conservative townspeople, but not caring one bit. "That's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." Mayor Henderson approached, smiling indulgently at their enthusiasm. "Miss Wright starts in 1 week, which will give her time to prepare the schoolhouse and review the lessons. The town is providing housing as part of the position, a small cottage behind the church. It's not much, but it's furnished and includes a garden plot." "It sounds perfect," Margot said, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Mayor Henderson. I promise you won't regret giving me this chance." "See that I don't," he said, but his tone was kind. "And Mr. Turner, on behalf of the town, I want to thank you for bringing Miss Wright to us. She's going to be a fine addition to our community." After the mayor departed, Nathan and Margot found themselves alone on the steps of the town hall. The sun was setting, painting everything in gold, and Nathan had never seen Margot look more beautiful. "You did it," he said softly. "You built yourself a new life." "We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." The reminder of his role in her new beginning brought with it the uncomfortable realization that his reason for staying in Los Alamos had just evaporated. Margot had a job, a home, a future. She didn't need him anymore. The thought sat like lead in his stomach. "I should probably head back to the Double T tomorrow," he heard himself say, though every fiber of his being rebelled against the idea. "I've been gone too long already. My boss is going to have my hide." Margot's smile faltered. "Tomorrow, but I hoped you'd." She trailed off, looking down at her hands. Nathan tipped her chin up with his finger, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You hoped I'd what? Stay?" "I hoped you'd stay in Los Alamos. With me." "Margot, I want that more than anything. But I have responsibilities, a job. I can't just abandon them." "I know. You're right. I'm being selfish." She pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's just that I've gotten used to having you around. I don't know what I'll do without you." Nathan's resolve, never particularly strong where Margot was concerned, crumbled completely. "What if I didn't go back to the Double T? What if I found work here in Los Alamos?" Hope flared in her eyes. "Could you do that? Would you want to?" "I'd do just about anything to stay near you, Margot Wright. These past few days have shown me what I want from life, and what I want is you. I want to wake up knowing I'll see your face. I want to hear about your day teaching the children. I want to build something with you, something real and lasting." "Nathan," she breathed, and there were tears on her cheeks now, but they were happy tears. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" He dropped to one knee right there on the town hall steps, not caring who might see, not caring that they'd known each other barely a week. Some things were too important to wait for, too right to question. "Margot Wright, I know this is fast. I know people will say we're crazy. But I also know that I love you, and I think I've loved you from the moment I saw you standing in that cabin doorway with a rifle in your hands and determination in your eyes. Will you marry me?" Margot made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled him to his feet. "Yes. Yes, of course I'll marry you." They kissed there on the steps as the sun set behind them, and Nathan felt something settle in his chest, something that felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both grinning like fools, Margot pressed her forehead to his. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since you carried me inside the cabin and made me that stew. You saved my life, Nathan Turner." "You saved mine right back," he replied. "I just didn't know it needed saving until I met you." They made their plans that evening, sitting on the porch of the Diamond Rest while the town settled in for the night around them. Nathan would ride back to the Double T to collect his wages and few possessions, explain the situation to his boss, and returned to Los Alamos within a week. In the meantime, Margot would move into the schoolhouse cottage and begin preparing for her first day of teaching. "It'll be the longest week of my life," Nathan said, holding her hand in the darkness. "Mine too. But we've already proven we can survive much worse than a week apart." "True. Though I don't have to like it." Margot laughed, that bright sound he'd come to treasure. "No, you don't have to like it, but you do have to promise me you'll come back. Wild horses couldn't keep me away." Nathan left at first light the next morning, though it took everything in him to mount Copper and point the horse south. Margot stood outside the hotel, wrapped in a shawl against the early morning chill, and waved until he was out of sight. The ride back to the Double T gave Nathan plenty of time to think about the choice he was making. He was giving up steady work and familiar surroundings for a woman he'd known barely a week, in a town where he had no connections and uncertain prospects. By any practical measure, it was madness. But Nathan had learned something important in his 26 years. The heart had its own wisdom, and sometimes you had to trust it even when logic said otherwise. What he felt for Margot wasn't infatuation or passing fancy. It was bone-deep certainty, the kind that made every other consideration fade to insignificance. His boss at the Double T, a grizzled rancher named Tom Nelson, took the news better than Nathan expected. "Can't say I'm surprised," Tom said, counting out Nathan's final wages. "I saw that look in your eye when you came back for your things. That's the look of a man who's had his world turned upside down by a woman." "Is it that obvious?" Tom chuckled. "Son, I've been married 42 years. I know that look because I wore it myself once upon a time. My advice: don't fight it. Life's too short to spend it without the person who makes you want to be better than you are." Nathan packed his few belongings, said goodbye to the men he'd worked alongside for the past 3 years, and headed back toward Los Alamos. But instead of retracing his exact route, he took a detour to the cabin where he'd first found Margot. The structure looked even more abandoned in the bright daylight, lonely and forgotten. Nathan dismounted and approached slowly, remembering the fear in Margot's voice when she'd first told him to go away. The relief when she'd finally admitted she'd been waiting for someone to find her. He found the ravine where Samuel had fallen without too much difficulty, following Margot's description. Looking down at the sheer drop and the jumble of rocks at the bottom, Nathan felt a wave of sorrow for the brother who'd sacrificed everything to give his sister a chance at a better life. It took him the better part of the afternoon, but Nathan managed to find a way down the ravine slope, carefully picking his way over loose shale and around boulders. He found Samuel's remains at the bottom, bones picked clean by scavengers but still recognizable as human. With reverence and care, Nathan gathered what was left and wrapped the remains in a blanket he'd brought for this purpose. Getting back up the ravine with his burden was even more difficult than the descent, but Nathan was determined. Samuel Wright deserved a proper burial, and Margot deserved the closure of knowing her brother had been laid to rest with dignity. By the time Nathan reached Los Alamos 3 days later, dust-covered and exhausted, it was late afternoon. He went first to the church, where he found the pastor and explained the situation. The pastor, a kind-faced man named Reverend Miller, agreed to perform a burial service the next day. Then Nathan went to find Margot. She was in the schoolhouse, arranging desks and organizing books, and when she saw him in the doorway, she dropped the slate she'd been holding and ran to him. "You're back. You're early. I wasn't expecting you for another few days." Nathan held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the tension of the past days drain away. "I couldn't stay away any longer, and I have something to tell you. You might want to sit down." Margot pulled back, studying his face. "What is it? What's wrong?" As gently as he could, Nathan told her about his trip to the cabin, about finding Samuel's remains and bringing them back for burial. He watched emotions play across her face, shock and grief and gratitude all warring for dominance. "You did that for me," she finally whispered. "You went back there and climbed down that ravine and brought my brother home. I know how much it weighed on you, knowing he was out there. I hoped it might bring you some peace to see him properly buried." Margot wept then, great racking sobs that shook her whole body, and Nathan held her through it all, murmuring comfort into her hair. When the storm of grief had passed, she looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "How do I deserve you? What did I do to be blessed with someone so good?" "You survived," Nathan said simply. "You kept your promise to your brother and you survived, and that was enough." The funeral was held the next morning in Los Alamos's small cemetery, overlooking the valley with mountains rising in the distance. Margot stood beside Nathan, holding his hand so tightly he lost feeling in his fingers, but he didn't complain. A surprising number of townspeople came to pay their respects, people who'd never known Samuel Wright, but who understood the importance of community and shared grief. Reverend Miller spoke about sacrifice and love, about the bonds between siblings and the hope of heavenly reunion. Then he turned to Margot and asked if she wanted to say anything. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "My brother Samuel was the best man I ever knew. He gave up everything to take care of me after our parents died. He dreamed of giving me a better life, and even though he didn't live to see it, his dream is coming true. I'm building that life now, here in Los Alamos, and I promise to make it a life that would make him proud. I love you, Samuel. Thank you for everything. Rest well." As they lowered Samuel's remains into the ground and covered them with earth, Nathan felt Margot lean into him, drawing strength. When it was done and the other mourners had drifted away, they stood alone by the grave. "He would have liked you," Margot said softly. "Samuel always said I needed someone strong and good, someone who would treat me as an equal. That's what you do." "I'm honored to hear it," Nathan replied. "And I wish I could have known him." They stayed a while longer, until the sun was high overhead and duty called them back to the world of the living. As they walked back toward town, Margot surprised Nathan by asking, "When should we get married?" "Whenever you want." "Tomorrow, next week, next month. I'm in no rush as long as I know you're mine." "Tomorrow," Margot decided. "I want to marry you tomorrow. I've already lost too much time to grief and waiting. I want to start our life together now." Nathan stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Are you sure? People might think." "I don't care what people think. I know what I want, and I want you. I want to be your wife. I want to build a home with you and fill it with love and maybe, someday, children. I want everything, Nathan, and I want it with you." The certainty in her voice, the fierce determination in her eyes, made Nathan's heart swell with love so intense it almost hurt. "Then tomorrow it is. I'll speak to Reverend Miller." Reverend Miller agreed to perform the ceremony the following afternoon in the church. Mrs. Patterson from the hotel offered to stand as witness, and Mrs. Chen insisted on providing a wedding meal at her restaurant. Word spread quickly through Los Alamos, and by the time Nathan and Margot arrived at the church, a small crowd had gathered. Margot wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Martinez from the dress shop had altered overnight, with wildflowers in her hair that Nathan had picked that morning. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, walking toward him down the aisle with a smile that outshone the candles flickering in their sconces. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged vows in voices that shook with emotion, promising to love and honor each other through whatever trials life might bring. When Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan cupped Margot's face in his hands and kissed her with all the love and promise he carried in his heart. The small crowd erupted in applause and cheers, and Nathan felt something settle in his soul, a sense of rightness that transcended words. This was what he'd been searching for his whole life without knowing it, this connection, this partnership, this love. The celebration at Mrs. Chen's restaurant was joyful and loud, with more people attending than Nathan had expected. It seemed the story of how he'd rescued Margot from the abandoned cabin had spread through Los Alamos, growing more dramatic with each retelling, and the townspeople had adopted them as a sort of romantic legend. To Nathan and Margot, Mayor Henderson declared, raising his glass. May their love be as enduring as these mountains and as constant as the New Mexico sun. Here, here, the crowd echoed, and Nathan pulled Margot close, kissing her temple. As the evening wore on and the celebration began to wind down, Nathan and Margot slipped away to the cottage behind the church that was now their home. It was small, just 3 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs. Nathan carried Margot over the threshold, making her laugh and set her down gently in the center of what would be their bedroom. "Mrs. Turner," he said, testing out the name. "How does it feel?" "Perfect," Margot replied, reaching up to cup his face. "Everything feels perfect." They came together with a passion that had been building since that first kiss on the town hall steps. All the longing and love and desire flowing between them as natural as breathing. Nathan was gentle with her, mindful that this was new territory for both of them, and Margot met him with an eagerness that made his heart soar. Later, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Margot traced patterns on Nathan's chest with her fingertips. "I used to think the worst thing that could happen to me was being stranded in that cabin, alone and afraid. But now I realize it was the best thing. If Samuel hadn't died, if I hadn't been waiting in that cabin, I never would have met you." "I'd like to think we would have found each other somehow," Nathan said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Some things are just meant to be." "You really believe that, in fate and destiny?" "I didn't used to, but I believe in us, and that's enough." Margot snuggled closer, her breath warm against his skin. "I love you, Nathan Turner. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for being exactly who you are." "I love you too, Margot Turner, and I plan to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." The first months of their marriage were a period of adjustment and joy. Margot threw herself into teaching, quickly becoming beloved by her students and their parents alike. She had a gift for making lessons engaging, for seeing the potential in every child no matter their background or ability. Nathan, meanwhile, had found work with a freight company that operated between Los Alamos and Santa Fe, hauling supplies and goods. The work was steady and paid well enough for them to save a little each month. He was gone for a few days at a time, but always returned to Margot's welcoming arms and home-cooked meals. They fell into an easy rhythm, their love deepening with each passing day. Nathan would often stop by the schoolhouse during the lunch hour when he was in town, and Margot would light up like candles at Christmas when she saw him. The children quickly learned that Mr. Turner's visits meant their teacher would be distracted and smiling for the rest of the afternoon. One evening in late spring, about 6 months after their wedding, Margot met Nathan at the door with news that made his heart skip. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach, her eyes shining with happy tears. "We're going to have a baby," she whispered. Nathan felt the world tilt on its axis in the best possible way. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "Are you sure? When? How are you feeling? Do you need to sit down?" Margot laughed at his rapid-fire questions. "I'm sure. The doctor confirmed it this afternoon. The baby should come in November, and I feel wonderful, Nathan, scared and excited and wonderful." A baby, Nathan breathed, setting her down carefully as if she might break. We're going to be parents. Are you happy? Margot asked, suddenly shy. I know we didn't exactly plan this so soon, but happy doesn't begin to cover it, Nathan interrupted, pulling her close. You've given me everything I never knew I wanted. A home, a purpose, and now a child. I'm the luckiest man alive. They spent that evening making plans, talking about names and nurseries and all the ways their lives were about to change. Nathan's hand kept drifting to Margot's stomach, marveling at the miracle growing inside her. As summer gave way to autumn and Margot's belly began to swell with their child, Nathan found himself consumed with preparations. He built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. He and Margot turned the cottage's third room into a nursery, painting the walls a cheerful yellow and hanging curtains that Margot had sewn herself. The pregnancy was not without its challenges. Margot suffered from sickness in the mornings and fatigue that left her exhausted by mid-afternoon. Nathan worried constantly, checking on her multiple times throughout the day when he was in town, bringing her ginger tea and crackers and anything else that might help. I'm fine, Margot would assure him, touched by his concern but also amused by his hovering. Women have been having babies since the dawn of time. I'm strong, and our child is strong. You'll see. As November approached, Nathan arranged to stay in Los Alamos rather than taking any freight runs. He wouldn't risk being away when Margot went into labor. She'd officially stopped teaching in October, turning her duties over to a temporary replacement, and spent her days resting and reading and preparing for the baby's arrival. Labor began on a cold November night, 3 days after the first snow. Nathan fetched the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, who delivered half the babies in Los Alamos, and then found himself relegated to pacing in the front room while Margot labored in their bedroom. The hours crawled by, each of Margot's cries of pain cutting through Nathan like a knife. He wanted to be with her, to hold her hand and offer comfort, but Mrs. Rodriguez had firmly ejected him from the bedroom, saying he'd only be in the way. Dawn was breaking when he finally heard it, the strong, angry wail of a newborn baby. Nathan rushed to the bedroom door just as Mrs. Rodriguez emerged, smiling. Congratulations, Mr. Turner. You have a son. A big, healthy boy with lungs like a blacksmith's bellows. Nathan barely heard her. He pushed past into the bedroom where Margot lay propped up on pillows, exhausted and pale but radiant with joy. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets, and as Nathan approached on shaking legs, his son opened his eyes and looked at him. Nathan, meet our boy, Margot said softly. I was thinking we could name him Samuel after my brother. Samuel Nathan Turner. What do you think? Nathan couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He nodded, tears streaming unashamedly down his face, and reached out to gently touch his son's downy head. The baby made a small sound and seemed to nestle deeper into Margot's arms. He's perfect, Nathan finally managed. You're both perfect. I love you so much, Margot. I love you too, she replied, smiling up at him with tired eyes. Thank you for this, for him, for everything. I have everything I ever dreamed of now. Nathan sat carefully on the edge of the bed, wrapping his arms around his wife and son, and felt complete in a way he'd never imagined possible. From tragedy and loneliness had come this perfect moment, this perfect family. Samuel Wright hadn't lived to see his dreams of prosperity come true, but his legacy lived on in the nephew who bore his name and in the sister who'd survived to build the life he'd wanted for her. The years that followed were full and happy. Nathan eventually saved enough to buy a small ranch outside Los Alamos, where he raised horses and cattle. Margot returned to teaching once Samuel was old enough to attend school himself, and proved to be just as skilled a mother as she was an educator. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Sarah when Samuel was 3, and another boy named James 2 years after that. The cottage behind the church grew too small, and they built a proper house on their ranch land, a sprawling structure with room for their growing family and the life they were creating together. Nathan never forgot that day when he'd stumbled upon the abandoned cabin and found Margot waiting inside. He often thought about the chain of events that had led him to her, how easily he might have ridden past without noticing the thin trail of smoke from the chimney. Some might call it chance. Nathan preferred to think of it as destiny. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Nathan surprised Margot with a trip back to the cabin. They rode out together, leaving the children in Mrs. Chen's capable care, and made their way through the familiar canyons and washes. The cabin was still standing, though more weathered than ever, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. They stood in the doorway together, Margot leaning back against Nathan's chest as his arms wrapped around her waist. "I was so scared that day you found me," she said softly. "I'd convinced myself that no one was coming, that I'd die alone in this place." "But you didn't give up," Nathan reminded her. "You kept the faith and you survived." "We both survived," Margot corrected, turning in his arms to face him. "And we did more than survive. We thrived. We built something beautiful from all that pain and fear." Nathan kissed her, still as affected by her presence as he'd been that first day. "Best decision I ever made, following that trail of smoke. Best promise I ever kept, waiting for someone to find me." They stayed at the cabin for a while, remembering and marveling at how far they'd come. Then they rode back to their ranch, to their children and the life they'd built, carrying with them the gratitude of 2 people who'd found exactly what they needed in each other. As the years continued to pass, the Turner Ranch became one of the most successful in the territory. Nathan's skill with horses earned him a reputation that brought buyers from as far away as Texas and California. Margot became the head teacher at the Los Alamos School, eventually training new teachers and developing curriculum that was adopted by other towns in the region. Their children grew strong and capable. Samuel, their firstborn, inherited his father's way with horses and his mother's intelligence, becoming a veterinarian who split his time between Los Alamos and Santa Fe. Sarah surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for mathematics and business, eventually taking over the financial management of the ranch and increasing its profitability threefold. James, the baby of the family, became a teacher like his mother, opening a school for Mexican and Native American children who'd been excluded from the main Los Alamos school. Through it all, Nathan and Margot's love remained the foundation upon which everything else was built. They still took evening walks together, still held hands like newlyweds, still looked at each other with the wonder of 2 people who couldn't quite believe their good fortune. On their 25th anniversary, their children threw them a party that seemed to include half the territory. People came from miles around to celebrate the couple who'd become something of a legend in the area. The story of how Nathan had found Margot in the abandoned cabin had been told and retold so many times it had taken on mythic proportions. But at its core, it remained a simple truth. 2 people had found each other when they needed each other most, and they'd built a life of love and purpose from that meeting. Mayor Henderson, now retired but still spry despite his advancing years, stood to give a toast. "I remember the day Nathan Turner brought Margot Wright to our town. She was half-starved and he was covered in trail dust, and I thought to myself, there's a story there." Little did I know it would be a story that would still be warming hearts 25 years later. To Nathan and Margot, who proved that love can bloom even in the harshest desert, and that sometimes the best things in life are found when we're looking for something else entirely. Here, here. The crowd echoed, raising their glasses. Nathan pulled Margot close, kissing her soundly despite the whistles and cheers from their children and grandchildren. Yes, grandchildren. Samuel had married a lovely woman named Alina and given them 3 grandchildren. Sarah was courting a banker from Santa Fe, and even young James, barely 20, had his eye on the new teacher who'd come to help at his school. "What are you thinking about?" Margot asked, her head resting on Nathan's shoulder as the party swirled around them. "How lucky I am. How blessed. How grateful I am for every single day I've had with you. Even the hard days, the years when the ranch nearly failed, when we lost that entire herd to drought, when Sarah was so sick with fever we thought we'd lose her, especially those days," Nathan said firmly. "Because we faced them together and we came through stronger. That's what love is, isn't it? Not just the easy moments, but the hard ones too, knowing you have someone standing beside you no matter what comes." Margot kissed him, her eyes suspiciously bright. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," Nathan replied, making her laugh. As the years continued their inexorable march, Nathan and Margot settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long and happy marriage. They spent their mornings having coffee on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun paint the New Mexico landscape in gold and amber. Nathan still worked with the horses, though he left the harder tasks to younger men now. Margot still taught, though she'd reduced her hours to focus on the students who needed extra help. They talked often about their early days, about the abandoned cabin and that first meeting. Nathan never tired of hearing Margot describe what she'd been thinking when she first saw him through the cracked door, how she'd been terrified but also desperate enough to hope. "I thought you might be an outlaw," she admitted one evening as they sat watching the sunset. "Or a drifter who'd rob me and leave me for dead. But then you spoke, and your voice was so kind, so genuine. I think I knew even then that you were someone special." "I thought you were going to shoot me," Nathan said, chuckling. "You were trying so hard to look fierce with that rifle, but your hands were shaking and I could see how scared you were. I was terrified. Of you, of dying alone, of having waited for nothing. And then you stayed. You didn't just give me water and ride away. You stayed and you cared and you changed everything." Nathan took her hand, his thumb rubbing across the wedding ring she'd worn for over 30 years now. "You changed everything for me too. Before I found you, I was just drifting through life, working and surviving but not really living. You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to be better than I was." "We saved each other," Margot said softly. "That's the real story, isn't it? Not that you rescued me, though you did, but that we rescued each other from lives that were less than what they could be." As Nathan approached his 60th birthday and Margot her 57th, they began to think about legacy and the future. The ranch was thriving under Sarah's management, with help from her husband Thomas, who'd proven to have a good head for business himself. Samuel's veterinary practice was booming. James's school had grown to include over 50 students and 3 additional teachers. "We did good work," Nathan said one evening, sitting on the porch with Margot as they'd done thousands of times before. "Our children are happy and successful. Our grandchildren are growing up strong. The ranch will continue long after we're gone." "Are you thinking about mortality?" Margot asked, studying his face in the fading light. "Some. More just thinking about how grateful I am. When I was a young man working cattle drives and ranch jobs, I never imagined I'd have all this. A wife I love more than life itself. Children who make me proud every day. Grandchildren who climb on my lap and beg for stories. Land that will support my family for generations. It's more than I ever dreamed." Margot leaned against him, fitting into the curve of his body as perfectly as she had 34 years ago when he'd first held her. I think about that cabin sometimes, about what would have happened if you'd ridden past, if you'd gotten your water and left, if you hadn't cared enough to stay. I couldn't have left you, Nathan said with certainty. Even if I'd tried, I would have turned back. Some part of me knew even then that you were important, that we were important. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear the sounds of family, of laughter and conversation. Sarah and her family were visiting for the week, and the house was full of the pleasant chaos of multiple generations under one roof. "No regrets?" Nathan asked, as he sometimes did. "Not a single one," Margot replied, as she always did. "You, only that I didn't find you sooner." Margot laughed, the sound still as bright and joyful as it had been when she was 23. "Then we would have been different people. We wouldn't have appreciated what we found in each other. Everything happened exactly as it was meant to." Nathan had to agree. The pain and loss that had brought Margot to that cabin, the chance tracking of a mustang that had led him to her, the courage it had taken for both of them to open their hearts to love, all of it had been necessary to create the life they now shared. As they grew older still, moving into their 60s and then 70s, Nathan and Margot's love became something the entire region recognized and respected. Young couples would come to them for advice. Troubled marriages would seek their counsel. They became symbols of what marriage could be at its best. Partnership, friendship, passion, and commitment all woven together into something stronger than the sum of its parts. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the celebration was even larger than their 25th had been. The governor of New Mexico Territory attended, along with what seemed like half the population of the surrounding counties. A journalist from Santa Fe interviewed them, wanting to write a story about their remarkable marriage. "What's your secret?" the journalist asked, pencil poised over his notebook. 50 years is a long time. How have you made it work?" Nathan and Margot looked at each other and smiled. They'd been asked this question countless times over the years, and their answer was always the same. "We choose each other," Margot said simply. "Every single day, we wake up and choose to love each other, to support each other, to be partners in everything. And we never forget how we started," Nathan added. "We both know what it's like to be alone, to be lost. We never want to go back to that, so we work every day to make sure the other person knows they're loved and valued." "Also," Margot said with a mischievous smile, "we still kiss every morning and every night no matter what. Even when we're fighting or tired or busy, that kiss is a promise renewed." The journalist scribbled furiously, and the resulting article spread across New Mexico Territory and beyond. Nathan and Margot received letters from strangers thanking them for inspiring hope, for showing that true love was possible and worth fighting for. But despite the attention and celebration, what mattered most to them was the quiet moments, the mornings on the porch, the evenings by the fire, the way Nathan still opened doors for Margot and she still lit up when he walked into a room. The way they could communicate entire conversations with just a look. The way they still reached for each other in the night, seeking comfort and connection. As Nathan approached his 75th birthday, his health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just the slow wearing down of a body that had lived a long and active life. His joints ached in the morning. His breath came shorter after exertion. He moved slower, tired more easily. Margot, who was 72 and still relatively spry, became his caretaker as seamlessly as she'd once been his partner in building the ranch. She helped him dress when his fingers were too stiff with arthritis. She made sure he took the medicines the doctor prescribed. She sat with him on the porch for hours, holding his hand and talking about their life together. "I'm not ready," Nathan said one evening as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "I'm not ready to leave you." Margot's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "Then don't." "Not yet. Stay with me as long as you can." "I've had a good life," Nathan continued, needing to say these things while he still could. "Better than I deserved. You gave me that, Margot. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," she corrected gently. "That's how it works. That's how it's always worked with us." Nathan rallied, his strong constitution and stubborn will giving him several more good years. He lived to see James married and starting his own family. He held his first great-grandchild, a boy named Nathan, in his honor. He celebrated his and Margot's 55th anniversary, surrounded by 4 generations of the family they'd created. But eventually, inevitably, his body began to fail in ways that determination couldn't overcome. On a cold January morning in his 79th year, Nathan woke early as was his habit and found he couldn't quite catch his breath. Margot immediately sent for the doctor, but they both knew what this meant. The doctor confirmed it. Nathan's heart was giving out. There was nothing to be done but make him comfortable and wait. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch, filling the house with quiet voices and whispered prayers. But when Nathan asked for time alone with Margot, they all filed out, leaving the couple who'd started it all together in the bedroom they'd shared for over 50 years. "I'm scared," Nathan admitted, his hand clasped tightly in Margot's. "Not of dying, but of leaving you." "How will you manage without me?" Margot's tears fell freely now, but she smiled through them. "The same way I've managed everything since the day you found me, by remembering what you taught me about strength and love and never giving up. You'll be with me, Nathan. Maybe not physically, but in every lesson you taught me, every moment we shared, every part of this life we built together." "I love you," Nathan said, his voice growing weaker. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you in that cabin doorway, and I will love you beyond this life into whatever comes next." "I love you too," Margot whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for 55 years of happiness I never thought I'd have." "Take care of our family," Nathan murmured. Tell them the story, about the cabin, about how we met. Make sure they know that love is worth fighting for, worth waiting for, worth everything." "I will, I promise." Nathan's breathing grew more labored, but his eyes stayed locked on Margot's face, drinking in the sight of her one last time. "You were worth every mile I traveled, every hardship I faced. You made my life mean something." "You made my life everything," Margot replied. As the morning sun climbed higher, filling the room with golden light, Nathan Turner took his last breath with his wife's name on his lips and her hand in his. He'd lived 79 years, and more than 50 of them had been spent loving Margot Wright Turner with everything he had. The funeral was the largest Los Alamos had ever seen. People came from across New Mexico territory and beyond to pay their respects to a man who'd been known for his integrity, his skill with horses, and most of all, his devotion to his wife. The church overflowed, and the mourners spilled out into the street, standing in respectful silence as Reverend Miller's successor spoke about Nathan's life and legacy. But it was Margot's eulogy that left not a dry eye in the congregation. Standing straight and strong despite her grief, she told the story one final time. The abandoned cabin, the starving woman waiting for rescue, the cowboy who'd been tracking mustangs and found something far more valuable. The love that had grown from that desperate meeting into something that had sustained them through more than 5 decades of life together. "Nathan used to say that finding me was the luckiest day of his life," Margot said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed church. But I was the lucky one. He gave me everything: a home, a family, a purpose, and most importantly, a love that never wavered. He saw me at my lowest point, my most desperate hour, and instead of riding away, he stayed. That's who Nathan Turner was. A man who stayed. A man who cared. A man who loved with his whole heart and never held back. She paused, struggling to continue. I know many of you are worried about me, about how I'll manage without him, but Nathan prepared me well. He taught me to be strong. He showed me what it means to choose love every single day. And he gave me 55 years of memories to sustain me through however many years I have left. I'm not alone. I have our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. I have all of you, this community that embraced us from the beginning. And I have the absolute certainty that what Nathan and I shared was real and true and worth celebrating. After Nathan was laid to rest in the cemetery overlooking the valley, Margot returned to the ranch house that suddenly felt too empty. But she didn't wallow in grief, though the loss of Nathan was a physical ache in her chest. Instead, she did what he would have wanted. She lived. She continued to teach part-time at James's school, working with the children who needed extra help. She spent time with her family, becoming the matriarch who held them all together with her strength and wisdom. She wrote down the story of her life with Nathan, starting from that day in the cabin and continuing through all the years that followed, wanting to preserve their love story for future generations. On what would have been their 58th anniversary, Margot returned to the abandoned cabin one last time. She was 75 now, still strong but feeling her age. The ride took longer than it once had, and she had to rest several times along the way. But she was determined to make this pilgrimage, to return to where it all began. The cabin had nearly collapsed, its roof caved in and its walls leaning at dangerous angles. But the stone chimney still stood, and Margot could still see the doorway where she'd first appeared to Nathan with a rifle in her shaking hands. She sat on a relatively stable section of the porch and let the memories wash over her. The fear and desperation of waiting. The sound of Nathan's voice calling out that he meant no harm. The moment when she'd opened the door and seen him standing there in the sunset light, tall and strong and kind. The feeling of knowing, even then, that her life was about to change. "I miss you," Margot said aloud, speaking to the wind and the mountains and whatever part of Nathan might be listening. "Every day I miss you. But you were right, my love. What we had, what we built together, it sustains me still. Our children are thriving. Our grandchildren are growing into remarkable people. Our great-grandchildren are starting to ask about you, wanting to know about the cowboy who found their great-grandmother in an abandoned cabin." She smiled through her tears. "I tell them the story, just like you asked. I tell them about love and faith and the courage it takes to trust someone with your heart. I tell them that you were the best man I ever knew, and that loving you was the greatest privilege of my life." Margot stayed at the cabin until the sun began to set, painting the sky in the same amber and crimson shades that had been there the day Nathan found her. Then she mounted her horse, a gentle mare that Nathan had trained years ago specifically for her, and rode back toward the ranch, toward home, toward the life that continued even in his absence. Margot lived another 7 years after Nathan's death, and though she missed him every single day, they were good years filled with family and purpose. She saw James's school expand to serve over 200 students. She held her first great-great-grandchild, a girl named Margot, in her honor. She attended Sarah's retirement party after 40 years of successfully managing the ranch finances. On a warm September evening, 70 years to the day after Nathan had first found her in the cabin, Margot Turner died peacefully in her sleep. She was 82 years old, and her final words, spoken to the great-granddaughter who was sitting with her, were, "Tell them the story. Make sure they know about the love." The family laid her to rest beside Nathan in the Los Alamos Cemetery, beneath the mountains that had witnessed their love story from beginning to end. The service was again large, attended by generations of people whose lives had been touched by the Turners in one way or another. Samuel, now in his 70s himself, stood to speak about his mother. "She was strong," he said simply. "Stronger than she ever realized. She survived tragedy and loss and built a life that mattered. But most importantly, she loved with everything she had. She loved our father with a devotion that inspired everyone who saw it. She loved us, her children, fiercely and without reservation. And she loved the life they built together, honoring it every day by living fully and well." As the years continued to pass, the story of Nathan and Margot Turner became part of the fabric of Los Alamos history. The ranch they'd built continued to thrive, passed down through the generations. The school where Margot had taught was eventually renamed in her honor. And young couples still sought out their grave site, leaving flowers and whispering prayers for love as true and lasting as the Turners had shared. The abandoned cabin where it all began eventually collapsed completely, reclaimed by the New Mexico wilderness. But before it fell, the Turner family had carefully preserved that stone chimney, transporting it stone by stone to the ranch and rebuilding it as part of a memorial garden. A plaque told the story of that September day in 1878, when a cowboy tracking mustangs found a woman who'd been waiting for someone to find her, and how that meeting had sparked a love story that would endure for decades and inspire generations. And so the story lived on, passed down from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild, a testament to the power of love, the importance of choosing to care, and the truth that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Nathan Turner found more than he was looking for that day. Margot Wright got the rescue she'd been praying for. And together, they created something that outlasted them both. A love that proved that even in the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the Old West, tender things could not only survive but flourish, growing stronger with each passing year until they became the stuff of legend.